What is up, everybody? My name is Kane Irvine. This is the heaviest show in the universe, and today I am going to be exploring the question, what was the first thrash metal album of all time? In this video, I'm going to be exploring the very early history of heavy metal, starting in 1969 and going all the way to the early 80s to really pin down what the first album from one of metal's most beloved genres truly was. And through my research, I found that the answer wasn't as obvious as I originally thought, so be sure to stick around until the end to find the answer that you are seeking. And before you mention X unknown band's first demo tape that literally no one of importance has ever described as an influence, sorry bro, they're not in this video. I'll be taking a close look at a vast array of music that prominent musicians within the scene and the genre have described as influences, not some underground tape that had literally zero effect on the scene. So thrash metal was birthed around 1980 to 1983 with a huge explosion of bands coming out after 1983 and completely cementing thrash as the dominant genre of heavy music. But the seeds of this style of music were being planted way before Exodus and Slayer were ripping up clubs in 1984. We can go as far back as 1972 and have a look at Deep Purple to hear what would later become that prototypical thrash eighth note picking on the open E string mixed with a little chromatic ascension and descension would later become the very heart and soul of thrash and even modern metal in today's day and age. And there would be tons of bands over the years that would weave this into their music, including Queen and Black Sabbath. But these are merely inspirations, the very roots of what would later become the new wave of British heavy metal and eventually thrash. So I think we need to move on to the mid and later times of the new wave of British heavy metal to really pin down this question. And those British bands were really the first ones to put true speed into metal way before any American or German band was ripping through measures at Mach 10. Def Leppard, Iron Maiden, and Saxon were some of the first musicians to fuse the dwindling punk scene of the UK with the heavy, doomy droning of Black Sabbath, putting some pep into the step of metal's new art form. But there was one band that took the punk influence and speed way farther than any other British band. Pure speed and intensity that was apparent in Motorhead's music was really jarring for people first listening to it in 1975 before the new wave of British heavy metal first took off. Punks and metalheads were usually at odds with one another, and this was a trend that would continue into thrash metal, but Motorhead somehow brought these guys together. The metalheads were angry that punk got all the mainstream attention in the UK, and the punks hated the virtuosity and flashiness of bands like Iron Maiden. But Motorhead gave them all a place to be heard, and together, the first true fusion of metal and punk. And while their music wasn't quite pure thrash metal, they, quote, were the first metal band to harness that energy, and in the process, they created speed metal and thrash metal. It's clear that Motorhead were one of the biggest influences on this scene, inspiring young musicians to take that teenage angst and power that's inside and turn it into fast and loud music. But as we said, their music wasn't pure thrash and was more of a grungy new album sound. So continue on we must. And our journey takes us to the very end of the new wave of British heavy metal's rise in the early 1980s. But by this time, the British scene had had its time in the spotlight, and a few bands like Iron Maiden and Def Leppard broke out of the crowded fad into mainstream superstardom. Of course, Maiden, Motorhead, Budgie, Tigers of Pantang, and Diamond Head are some of the most influential acts of this era. These bands all wrote about the same escapist topics of dragons and wizards and other epic shit like that. But at the very end of the first wave of new album, one band seriously took metal to the next level and are arguably the most influential band out of all of those previously mentioned. Lay down your soul to the And Venom were way faster, more intense, and more evil than any of their new wave of British heavy metal counterparts. Their gimmick, imagery, and heaviness were all completely next level, and it's here where we start to truly hear the sound of thrash metal. And in my opinion, it's definitely plausible to theorize that their second album, Black Metal, was the first thrash metal album of all time. That speed and evil imagery would come to define not only thrash, but black and death metal as well. This band has been crazy influential, and black metal is where we find the very first pure thrash metal track. Songs like Black Metal, Leave Me in Hell, and Sacrifice show thrash chops that rival Slayer and Metallica's epic debuts in 1983. Speaking of which, I wouldn't be doing this video topic justice if I didn't talk about Kill 'Em All. And a lot of people believe that this was the album that was the very first pure, unadulterated thrash metal album. It's hard to disagree. It really is. It was the album that truly set off the thrash metal bomb, the one that everyone tried to copy, and everyone did copy. Of course, Show No Mercy was released shortly after and was also incredibly influential, even on the black metal scene. But let me ask you, who were Metallica and Slayer trying to copy? Of course, that's right, it was Venom. And either of their first two albums could be considered early thrash metal, but my money is on black metal, because Welcome to Hell still has a lot more of that British groove that other new album bands had that diluted the thrash vibe out of their music. And before I make a final quote on the topic, a quick shout out to Heavy Metal Maniac by Exciter, which was released in 1983, even before Kill 'Em All, but it's more of a heavy metal or power metal album, though it borders on thrash. I don't want to call it speed metal because speed metal is one of the dumbest genres ever thought of. Speed metal is literally thrash metal. We gotta stop trying to overthink this. But in my opinion, black metal is the first thrash metal album of all time. And people also like to say that this is the first black metal album, and I think that's way out of line. It's way more thrash than black metal, though the imagery and the lyrical topics were incredibly influential on the black metal scene, I'll give it that. At least not as black metal as we would come to know it. And this album inspired Metallica and Slayer and Megadeth and Creator, Overkill, anyone you could think of in the thrash scene. They knew who Venom was, and they had listened to black metal, and they were copying the black metal formula. Mad respect to Venom. Alright, so what do you think? Am I completely out to lunch on this topic? Let me know down below what you think the first thrash metal album was, and give me your points countering mine. Or maybe you agree with me. That'd also be cool to hear. Thank you so much for watching. We will see you in the next video. And of course, long live metal.